Well, kick us off talking just a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are, man.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a COBOL programmer out of college, right? Like back in the day, and I started working for a bank pretty much straight out of college. I did that for a few years and worked for a couple of FinTechs, and then I got this gig back in '99 with what was Equifax Card Solutions, which got renamed to Certegy, which got bought by Fidelity when they spun off FIS. So that's kind of my path through to the company. Most of my work in Australia before I moved to the US was around card portfolio migrations, going to banks and saying, you don't know how to do this, we know how to do it. Run it on our platforms in our data center, with our support people and your logo on the card. And we did that with like top 50 global banks. Um, Again, the market in for FIS internationally for card issuing is quite different from the US. The US we process for thousands of like community banks and we have a couple of forays into the upper end of the market, but outside of the US, it is typically just the big banks that we process for. So kind of got to the position where the next place in Australia to go with FIS was my boss's job or out. And I didn't want her job. I'm not smart enough to do her job. So I started looking for roles at, internationally with FIS. And I got a really good offer for a global consolidation role. At the time, we were running about 11 different cards platforms globally. Some of that was just customers staying on old stuff. Some of it was us buying companies that had different platforms and sort of running them both at the same time. And so the role was very much how do we get everybody on to the same version or the same platform? So I moved to the US in uh, May 2019, 6 months before COVID, which was an interesting time. My boss, who I moved over to work for, she left the company 2 days after I landed in the US. My wife and son hadn't even got here yet. Oh, there. Sorry, I'm back in Australia now, but they hadn't even got
Hang
to the
on.
US yet.
I want
I
to
didn't
see
even
how far
tell them.
I want to see how far he's going to go with this story because this is a hell of a story right here. But keep
Okay.
going, man. Keep going.
Uh, it was interesting times. So I sort of tried to do that role, but it was like reassigned. And then Mike Cressy, who you've had on your show, was looking for a strategy lead for cards and money movement across the whole company. And so I spoke to him and I took that role on. So for the last 5 years in the US, I've really looked at again, consolidating our platforms, embedded finance, B2B, as our kind of consumer payments portfolio has grown. It's like, what's next? How do we make it bigger, better? How do we do it, more cost effectively? How do we work with fintechs? Because I think FIS back in the day was like we can build everything ourselves, and now I think we've very much realised that there's niche players out there who can do it a heck of a lot better than we can. And why try and be everything when we can integrate with those players and bring them on and make them part of our solution? And so then in July this year, I moved back to Australia with the family. Again, with FIS, they've done me very well over the years. And my new role is it's kind of a combined role. I'm looking after the team of product specialists who understand all of our banking solutions products across Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Um, and I'm also the vertical industry specialist, if you like, for card issuing for outside of the US.
Okay,
So
so he
it's
left out the best part. When he did this, he didn't tell his wife what was happening yet. She's over here packing up everything. This is so cool. You talk about faith, luck, the whole thing, just trading.
Yeah, yeah. I think we spoke about splitting the duties of moving the family overseas, and my job was to go over a couple of months early, buy the new house and set up the new house, and her job was to like pack up the old house and get it on the rental market back in Australia. It wasn't a 50-50 split. Her job was much harder than mine. It's much easier to like buy new stuff and put it in a house than it is to like get everything sorted. So yeah, she was a little stressed at the time. So when I found out that the person that I'd convinced her that was, the great leader that I was going to move across the country for, or across the world for, left the company, I sort of I didn't tell her for a couple of weeks until things calmed down a little.
That's great.
Hoping things work out, right?
Yeah. I was kind of
Yeah,
playing chicken with that, but it worked out, so that's good.
That's good. That's good, man. Well, so you got a really cool perspective. I mean, I don't think any of us and any of the experts that you ask are guessing, at so many of the current events and things, but you got a really cool perspective of definitely US now and rest of the world. So at FIS, man, what are you guys looking at? I mean, what is the difference? I mean, we can all see some of the macro differences between the US and the rest of the world, but just strategically, let me tell you a couple things I'm thinking about. So if you looked at the US and abroad for some of the FIS competitors, there's been kind of big bets on big plays, right?
Yep.
Maybe some worked out and maybe some misses, but pretty focused strategies that also has left some pretty big holes, and some of those have been boo-boos as well. I've always looked at it like FIS, actually, your point is pretty comprehensive, right? I mean, obviously we've got the payments focus and we all, know some of the stories there. But otherwise, I mean, really trying to be wide to your point and more or less kind of focused on everything. But what does that look like from your perspective? And what does it look like US versus rest of the world? Is it different?
It is different, but I would say it's only different in a matter of timing. So I see the world all going in the same direction, but we did buy now, pay later, or a version of it for Asia in 2003, right? And it was launched, as you know, in Australia in maybe 2010, and it didn't really hit here until the 20s, right? So it's not that it's different; it's just that the US system moves a little slow. It's the oil tanker, and it takes a bit more to move. Whereas some of the Asian countries and the smaller European countries can be a little more nimble. So we're seeing, like, I mean, GDPR, for example, and actually that's not down to being nimble. That's down to having a government that says, all right, enough, we're doing this. And everybody going, oh, okay, we'll do that, which doesn't happen in the US, right? The government says, oh, I think we should do this. And half the people go, we don't want to do it, right? So it's a very different sort of setup. But as far as FIS is concerned, what we're looking at, it's interesting having one of everything, or in most cases, having three of everything, like, three cores and three card platforms, debit, credit, prepaid, whatever. We've got whatever you want, right? Literally, we can go into the kit bag and pull out virtually anything you want. What we want to do is we don't want to sell you three different things that overlap so much that we could sell you one thing, right? It looks great at the time. Hey, we'll sell you a debit platform. Now we'll sell you a credit platform. Now we'll sell you a prepaid platform, right? You've got one vendor to deal with. That's kind of an advantage. What's really an advantage is if you run all three of those things on one platform, and you only have to integrate once, and you only have to get compliant once, and you only have to train your staff once, that the total cost of ownership goes way down there. So we are really looking at, all right, we've got everything. How do we package it up in such a way that our customers don't have to buy 15 things to do 15 functions? They can buy one or two things to do those 15 functions. So that's a big push. And we've got a slight advantage there in that the card platform that we took out of the US back in 2000, and sort of started developing this international version of it. You can imagine that a credit union in New Zealand doesn't have the same requirements as a top 50 global bank in Europe, but we're running them on the same platform. So to do that, the way we've sort of put it all in one place, I think is definitely a push for how we're moving forward, and it's definitely a trend that I think is going to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you like. It's really going to become a huge advantage for big players.
I didn't know y'all even said that. I thought that was a Texas thing. Okay. So I've got a list of questions. I do this to people I like. I beat them up. Tanner, you got anything else you want me to?
I just wanted to point out, I love what you said there about total cost of ownership. That is such a better way to think about some of the problems, especially in the community banking space, right? When you don't have the size and the scale, and you think about, you got somebody in the back office that's logged into a dozen different admin portals. And I mean, just the management and the operations support, it's a lot. And I think cost of ownership is such a contrast away from the cost of the actual product, right? You're really getting towards ROI, man. I like that. Like that.
Yeah, I mean, you think just about like Visa or MasterCard make a legislative change, right? You've got to do that in your debit card system. You've got to do that in your credit card system. You've got to do that in your prepaid system. And now you've blown your entire enhancement budget for the year just in effort and time and cost. So yeah, anything you can do to reduce that, I think is advantageous.
Good call.
That's great. Yeah, you got your monthly changes and everybody has to keep up. And I said this to people so many times. I don't care which piece of banking we're talking about. Getting in there and doing it the first day, that's tough. I'm like, that's nothing. Maintaining this thing going forward, that's the tough part.
It is
It
a
is a
hard
question. It's a good interview question.
There you go.
What do I do every day? So my kind of regardless of the role, and I've been in 15 roles at FIS, my day tends to be, it tends to end up being explaining to people in the line of business why we can't charge that much or we'll never sell it, and explaining to salespeople why we can't charge that little or we'll never be able to run it, and trying to find that ground in between to sort of say, look, I understand where you're coming from, and tech is hard, but if you charge that much, we're never going to sell it, right? We're going to lose every deal. And then going back to sales and say, I know you want to sell it the less than the competition, but it costs us more than that to run it. So we can't sell it for that little. And how do we like get that crossover in between? And so most of my day is living as a translator, if you like, between the tech and the business side of the company and bringing them together.
We have the same job pretty much.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right. So this is the part where I'm going to really provoke you.
Okay.
On a global, when you just, again, travel the world, you see all these systems, you see the world and the way it works in banking. And we'll get to the US here in a second, but the difference between the payment systems in the US and the global payment system. We laughed a little bit last time we were hanging out about, just how, I guess, antiquated maybe is a word, or maybe just discombobulated is a word for the US compared to everybody else.
It's certainly layered. There's no straight line between A and B, right? You've got to go through 15 different things to get there. It's interesting with 10,000 whatever it is banks and credit unions. If you say we don't want to do checks anymore, if Chase Bank said I don't want to do checks anymore, they'd lose millions of customers overnight, right? Whereas if you've got a country like Australia or Canada or the UK that has a large population serviced by a small number of banks, and then the rest by a whole lot of additional ones, but the vast majority, like an 80-something% of Australians, bank with 4 banks. When those 4 banks get together and go, you know what, checks are terrible, right? They cost a lot to process. They're really bad with fraud. The security on them's horrible. Let's stop issuing checks. Then everyone goes, oh, I guess we're not doing checks anymore. And they don't all move somewhere else because there's nowhere else to go. Whereas in the US, you've got to be really careful about saying, we're not having branches anymore. We're not having checks anymore. We're getting rid of this old stuff because people like the stuff they've got today. And systems get built up around it. I mean, the infrastructure in the US that's built up around, I'm going to receive a check. I mean, I didn't know what lockbox was till I came here, right? It's like it just didn't even occur to me. There needs to be a service to accept these secure checks. So because of the sheer size and complexity of it, it's really hard to change because people don't want to change. So that's part of the reason why. Because of that, I mean, checks are a terrible way. Oh, let me write on a piece of paper. I promise to pay Dave $100, and I give that to my bank, and he gives it to someone else, and it goes down the line. And guess what? We don't know if it's fraud or not. So what we'll do is we'll wait a week before we give them the money and hope that if it's fraud, someone puts their hand up and says, "Where's this money coming from?" I mean, it's a terrible fraud check as well, right? But because it's like institutionalized, it's really hard to unpick. So what it means is when someone comes up with a cool new idea, hey, let's do like real-time payments, let's do real-time fraud, let's do whatever it is, you're left with this infrastructure that doesn't really cope with it very well. What it does mean is that the innovation around the edges of that gets very cool. So what I have seen in the US is like, all right, we've got checks. We're not going to get rid of them. How do I cash a check? Hey, here's some technology. I can take a photo of the check and send it in. That doesn't get used anywhere else because we don't use checks anywhere else. But it's quite a cool way of getting around it. And in doing that technology, that video technology and stuff, that led on to, doing online KYC checks and all sorts of
Right.
other stuff. So the innovation that has to like live around the edges of this old clunky system is actually driving a whole lot of other cool things. So it's like,
That is such a badass perspective. I'd never even thought about that. So the actual downside to progress of competition, we all know the upside, right? But the downside is, it makes you slow and cranky. But then you have the little clever people that come up with the outside peripheral things that actually lead to completely different things we didn't see coming. I love it. Another good thing for competition. All right,
right.
man. So I'm gonna get you another one right between the eyes. You ready?
Okay.
All right. So community banks in the US, are they toast? Is there a path to freedom? Is there a path to success? Will we ever get to a point to where they are a stronger competitor to the bigger banks in the U.S.?
And is there a size? It's
Yeah.
what I in every conversation, even people like us that love community banking and see the value, it's a closed door conversation with everybody right now. Is there a minimum size to be able to hang? Right? I mean, even if you said 100 million or
Yeah.
200 million, right?
You see this like in Canada, and I saw it when I went overseas when you mentioned, 4 banks, right? We really have 4 banks here. And then we have all these other guys. And is there, I mean, those are the ones we're all struggling to keep in survival mode because the consequences are we become just like everyone else. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think this is my opinion, not my company's opinion. I think I love community banks. I love the concept of, you know what, we're going to band together and actually get some buying power for our local town, region, whatever it is. I mean, the concept is fantastic. I think Gen Alphas and Gen Zs don't care about that as much because they're online a lot and the world's bigger. And if your digital banking front end is not really as good as the big players because they can afford to spend millions and millions on it, and you have to take sort of a choice of the ones that are out there, you're going to lose customers because of that. And that's my fear. I think the concept of community banks is great, and I think our generation gets it and values it. I'm not sure the kids coming up are going to value it as much, and that's going to be the biggest problem. So I don't think it's a size thing. I think if a community bank can crack, how do I keep my technology on a level playing field without it costing me the earth? How do I, have that engagement and that experience and stay focused and modern and all those kind of things? I mean, community banks can be more nimble than some of the big banks, and with the changes in stuff, they've really got to look at how do I maybe I don't have the millions and millions of dollars to invest in front ends and stuff, but how do I do cool stuff that still makes me relevant to the next generation? And that's the ones that are going to survive. And I'm not sure that certainly the amount of money they've got to spend on their infrastructure and their interface and their experience is going to depend on the size of the bank, right? But how nimble they are and how quickly do they look into you know probably not crypto but these days, but whatever's coming next that the young folks are interested in, that will keep them relevant. And so that's really where they've got to keep the lights on, and they've got to keep the basic infrastructure there as bread and butter. But their branches are going to get used for banking less and less. But maybe how do we make the branches used for how about you come into the branch, have a coffee, and work from here for the day, right? How do you reposition the assets that you've got to be relevant to that next generation? That's what's going to be the survival of the community banks. And they're going to have to think outside the box to do it. It can't just be, hey, Joe and Mary banked with us, so their kids are going to bank with us. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. That's great, Matt. I know Tanner's got some embedded questions for you. That was actually where I was kind of headed with that. It seems like Tanner calls it a throat to choke. So when you're pissed off about things, you want to go somewhere and yell at somebody or talk to them or see them face to face. That is just absolutely lost in the digital world, right? And,
Right.
And is there enough value in that, along with the new technology you're talking about, to expand different services or power others through banking and service or whatever? Tim, you had a question about embedded.
Yeah, I mean, I look back to throat to choke, right? I mean, I had plenty of those relationships that I'm just a local thinking guy anyway, right? But I want to make sure I could get to somebody that I never have, You know, I've never been there, but it's important to me that it's there. And I think if you looked at community banking, it's a lot different if we're talking about retail versus small business. That concept becomes a heck of a lot more important. And I think
Yeah,
if you look at the BaaS and embedded space, you know, let's call it maybe 900 or so commercial banks in the US and 142, I think, now that are in the BaaS and embedded side of the world and playing with those folks that are playing on the edges, like you talked about,
right.
sponsoring guys, be it through payments or we're starting to see a lot more in lending, right? And so I'm seeing some nimble thinking community banks that are doing things that are outside of their geographies, to your point. And that's kind of where I was going to ask. I know, you know, FIS has got more and more focus there and got more and more FIS banks that are doing things there in the US. But I guess that's kind of part one, your thoughts there. And then part two is looking at the rest of the world, back to your point, there's a lot more history there, right? Things have been going that direction for a while.
They have. Um, so I think the fundamental problem and the reason embedded finance is so interesting in the US and globally is that small business has been underserved by the banking market, just totally underserved. It's like, you know, you want a commercial banking product. Give me 15 years worth of bank statements and tell me what your board looks like and whatever ridiculous things are being asked for, right? Or you want something like cool and easy? Well, here's a consumer credit card, but we're not going to give you the reporting you need and the structure you need and all that kind of stuff. And there's kind of nothing in between from the banking point of view. And there's a huge demand for it. And bizarrely, I don't think that's an area where the US is any further behind than the rest of the world. I don't see that being well done anywhere. So I think that at the moment, that market of how do I get to a small business? How do I stop them from having to spend like a 14-hour day running their cafe or their landscaping business or whatever it is, and then have to come home and do their books and do their banking and do whatever for another 3 or 4 hours, right? How do we either automate it or build it into their processes? Or again, like back to what I said at the start, total cost of ownership is not just about money, it's also about time, right? And small businesses have no time. If you can like say, guess what? You no longer have to log on to an accounting platform and a banking platform and an invoicing platform and this and this. And if you can put it all in one place, just that saves them time and money and effort. So it's a super interesting market. I think it's underserved everywhere. I think the US has a huge number of small businesses. So there is like a massive market there ready to go after. So I think there's actually an advantage here in the US of getting that right. And there's low hanging fruit there as well, right? If you can
That was
just put
really,
an invoicing platform in your internet banking front end, like that saves them hours.
yes.
So I think it's a really interesting market. I don't know if I answered your question because I went off
No, it's
on a
great.
tangent in my head.
I think you hit
Perfect.
something that everyone is missing, and it's that. So I've made the comment before of I think BaaS and embedded is sort of the next evolution of commercial banking, right? And in the future, it'll be the next evolution of even small business banking. And it's hilarious to me that you sit down and talk to a community bank, you'll talk to a commercial bank, and they will have the strongest perception that we have to win in small business. And that's why we're not going to be in BaaS and embedded finance. And I'm like, we better hope that I'm wrong or you're dead, right? Because I think you just missed that one by a country mile, you know? And I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
I've had those conversations, Matt, where literally I'm looking at people that I have a lot of respect for. And literally I'm like, man, I hope that I'm missing something because you just made a really strong decision against something that sure smells the way of the future. So I think you said a lot more than you thought maybe that you did there. I
Well, thanks.
really, really agree with your point, man. I do. I love it.
So it's interesting to me. I think the old adage that nobody wants to buy a quarter-inch drill bit. They want a quarter-inch hole, right? And you've got to find out what the customer wants. They don't want to buy an invoicing system. They want time back in their lives, right? And community banks and credit unions are much more in touch day to day with their customers than a large bank is. So I mean, they're really well positioned to say, what's taking up your time? What is it you want? What do you want your banking solutions to do? And be able to either deliver that or come to fintechs and ask for, can we get this, because we're hearing that our banks don't want to do it this, our customers don't want to do it this way, they want to do it that way instead. And I that relationship that they have, that like at the coalface understanding what people are doing, That's really valuable in a community bank. That's where they can win. As I was saying before, if they can work out what it is that the next generation or even the current generation of small business owners want and deliver that, doesn't matter if their internet banking front end is a couple of years old, right? If they can save them time elsewhere, they will keep those customers all day long.
Good call.
Okay, one more time. He said they don't want a 1/4 inch drill bit; they want a 1/4 inch hole. I'm gonna steal the hell out of that. I think that's a great line.
That's not mine, by the way. That's some Stanford professor came up with that, and I'm maybe misquoting that as well. But yeah, it's a conversation we have internally. I say, look, we've got to stop going into banks and selling them our drill bits. Guess what? We just built a bright, shiny new drill bit. They're like, I don't care. I've got regulatory problems. We need to find out what it is they're actually after. We've got the drill bits. We'll bring the drill bits along later, right, to solve it. What's the problem you're trying to solve at the moment? And I think community banks are actually really well positioned to have those conversations.
That
Yeah,
was really well said, and such a good position going back to what you were talking about that you do every day. You're the you're the person that gets to sit and make the product and the problem match, right?
Right,
That job. That's great, man.
right.
I love it. Hey, I want to give you, man, just a couple of minutes here at the end. Anything in the world you want to talk about? Final thoughts? Anything you're working on? Favorite football team? We call it soccer, but whatever your favorite.
Yeah, so we call it Australian rules football, and it's not soccer and it's not rugby. It's a whole nother sport. You should look at it on YouTube. My football team has done so poorly over the last 5 years. I'm thinking of like changing to watch American football instead going forward. Um, what else have we got? I think there's some really interesting stuff happening in fraud, and I think I kind of mentioned it briefly before, but I think real-time payments is a thing. Like FedNow, although again, the US haven't said you will do real-time payments. They've said we think you should do this, and banks are kind of doing it. So it'll take a little longer, but it'll come, right? Because customers want money now, even if it's just I want to pay you for lunch. I want to know that it's gone through and you've got it and all those kind of things. The problem with real-time payments is the fraud systems for old payment money transfers do rely heavily on let's wait a couple of days, right? I'm going to do an ACH. Don't let him spend it for a couple of days, right? And we'll make sure that Tanner's happy that the money came out of his account before we let Dave spend the money, right? That's not a good fraud solution. Like finding out that you are who you say you are and you send it where you meant to send it and it's gone to the right place. That's a much better way of doing fraud. And with real-time payments, you have to do that. So I think there's this. We've seen it because that real-time payments happened in the UK like 10 years ago now. It happened in Australia about 6 or 8 years ago. So we've seen it happen. Fraudsters don't say, oh, there's a new fraud thing in place. I'm going to go and get a real job now, right? They move on to the next weakest link in the chain, which is why when they put chips on cards, we didn't see a drop in fraud. We saw all the fraud move to online fraud, right? Where you don't, or card not present fraud. So when real-time payments comes in, if you're not thinking fraud front and center with your real-time payments solution, then you're setting yourself up for some real exposure, because at some point in all of the systems around the world, when real-time payments has come in, the fraudsters have worked out a way to very quickly get some money out of that platform. So you've got to bake it in from the ground up, and it's not like any fraud you've done in the past.
That's a good call out, man. A lot of these conversations just a few years ago, it was the running joke was that, the acronym should be real-time fraud, right? I mean, because how do we avoid that? So much that we've built and everything is based on, we have a lot of batch core systems, right? I mean,
right.
We're just not ready for this. But to your point, I think getting there puts everybody through a good exercise. We could come out at a better place.
We could, and I think the US is really good at saying, we'll do it our way, which is great in certain circumstances. But when you have these things where it's happened before, right? It's like, oh, well, we're not Asia. Yeah, but they solve some of the same problems you're looking at today, right? Or, we're not UK. You're not the UK. It's a very different system. But they had these batch cores and they had to move to real time and they went through the process. So, and by the way, people who work in banks in the UK typically aren't competing with you in your regional bank in Ohio. You can call them up and have a conversation and they'll tell you anything you want to hear, right? They're they're not keeping that secret because fraudsters are the enemy of everybody. So I feel like you really got to think, outside the US, not necessarily to adopt the same solution, but to try and learn from some of the stuff that's happened elsewhere. And I'll tell you, the rest of the world's super happy to learn from the US. When the US does something first, and we then go and try and do it somewhere else in the world, they first of all say, well, what happened and how do we do it better? They're absolutely happy to look at the US. US seems like to think that, that's very different from us, so we're not going to learn from it. And I feel like that's a real failing. And the ability to like sort of, dig in and investigate what's happened elsewhere with real-time payments, with fraud, with enterprise payments, with buy now, pay later. Buy now, pay later went through the same process everywhere in the world. We'll lend you heaps of money. Oh, everyone got into trouble. Oh, we better regulate it so we can't like do it for everybody. And it went through that phase everywhere. And every new place we went into, the same thing happens. Like learn from the other world's mistakes. But anyway, that's my little
That's really good. You said something a minute ago about because there's so many banks and because it's so different, we end up with a rule change or whatever, kind of developing on the outside crazy things that end up being whole new markets and other. And I'm hoping that, that's kind of what happens here. I always tell people, when you got, again, back to a handful of banks in the country, it's a lot easier to solve problems than when you got thousands of them and you're competing against credit unions and you got community banks and big banks and then you've got international. It makes it much more complex. And then you've also got a lot of, let's just say, rules and rights and things here that you don't have other places. And so maybe that's the answer. Is there somewhere on the outside that, if there's one damn thing about Americans, we'll figure it out. We'll work the problem. That I don't want to say ingenuity or creativity, but yeah, we kind of kick the world's ass in that department. And so that's just kind of what we do best is think of crazy shit and then, we'll figure it out from there. And maybe that's where the answers for some of this stuff comes from.
But to the point, we don't always have to get there the hard way. There's occasionally a cheat code if you look at what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah. Hey, look, the smart fintechs that you and I speak to at, AFT and conferences like that, they have found different ways of doing stuff, right? They've found ways of getting around, doing whatever. There's a number of payments providers, I'm thinking neural payments, for example, who have worked out, we're not going to go through this roundabout route here. We're going to go A to B. And that's, it may not be a market that everybody buys tomorrow, but it's better than everything else. So let's do this. And so, yeah, it shows up, I think, in some of these smaller players. That's where you get, smaller players that like the Square and whatever that turn into, and Stripe that turn into like massive kind of global players, but they just came up with solving a really small local problem to start with.
One little sliver variation, all of a sudden, an entire industry. It's crazy. Brought up neural. I talked to Mick this morning.
Yeah, they're a great shop.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, man, we had a ball. This is exactly what I was hoping we could do. I hope it was fun for you. It was fun for us. I love to get the international perspective. It's, we're community bank guys. We're also Texas guys. So the U.S. is a big place to us, right? So we really, really appreciate it, man. I had a good time and we'll look forward to catching up with you again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And I'll see you the next AFT, if not before.
Sounds good, man.